USS Smith, a Mahan-class destroyer, was part of Task Force 16 in late October 1942, and in combination with Task Force 17 under the overall command of Admiral William Hulsey, they engaged Japanese forces under the overall command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was sending his combined fleet south to attack American forces in and around Guadalcanal. On the morning of the 26th of October, the Smith and the other American ships in Task Force 16 came under attack by Japanese aircraft, and in the ensuing melee, the Smith was struck by a Japanese torpedo plane. The plane crashed into her forecastle, engulfing the forward part of the ship in flames, and later, the torpedo the plane carried detonated. Acting quickly, her skipper, Lieutenant Commander Hunter Wood, steered his vessel into the sizable spray the fast battleship USS South Dakota was kicking up. As the water rushed across the bows of the ship, along with the efforts of the crew, the fires were extinguished. Due to the handling of the ship and the strained efforts of the crew, she was saved. However, the crew suffered a heavy blow. The ship's casualties totaled 69, 51 of which were fatalities. 22 confirmed, and the remaining 29 were missing in action. The ship suffered heavy damage, yet still managed to keep afloat, making it back to Pearl Harbor for repairs, surviving the war and being stricken in 1947. As I mentioned in the introduction, USS Smith was a Mahan-class destroyer, being one of the first destroyers authorized after the First World War. The construction was to be the first replacement for older destroyers, and it would help establish shipbuilding skills and ease some of the unemployment of the Depression period. Smith was commissioned on September 19, 1936, and with her armament of 5 single 5-inch 38 caliber guns, 12 torpedo tubes and 3 quad mounts, 50 caliber machine guns for anti-aircraft weaponry, this being upgraded throughout her career, she was a formidable destroyer. And with her machinery providing for 36.5 knots, she could easily keep up with the fast capital ships, especially the carriers of the fleet. All of this on 1,500 tons standard displacement. Smith would need that speed in late October 1942, as she and the other ships under the command of Admiral Kinkaid were attempting to halt a Japanese thrust towards Guadalcanal. The Japanese, frustrated with the already 3 months of hard fighting in and around Guadalcanal, planned a coordinated operation between the Army and Navy, where the Japanese Army on Guadalcanal would attack the United States Marines defending Henderson Airfield, while a strong Japanese force would sweep in and ambush the U.S. Navy warships coming to assist the beleaguered island. The Japanese force was divided into 3 groups: the advance force, the striking force, and the vanguard force, under the overall command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The overall force had 4 carriers, 4 Congo-class ships, 8 cruisers, and 25 destroyers. This combined fleet was striking south to destroy the U.S. naval forces supporting Guadalcanal. On the American side, Admiral Hulsey was equally as determined as his Japanese adversaries to keep control of these islands, where he sent 2 carrier task forces out to meet the Japanese advance. Task Force 16 under the command of Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid, with the carrier Enterprise and the battleship South Dakota in his task group, 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers, including the Smith. Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral George Murray had the carrier Hornet, 4 cruisers, and 5 destroyers. Task Force 64 was off Renau Island under Rear Admiral Willis Lee, with the battleship Washington, 3 cruisers, and 6 destroyers. Where on the 24th of October, Halsey sent orders for his task force commanders, and in the late James D. Hornfisher's Neptune's Inferno, the U.S. Navy at Guadalcanal, he writes, "Just before midnight on October 24th, as his Marines ashore were battling the Japanese assault, Halsey radioed his principal naval commanders Kinkaid and Lee, with a galvanizing message that would echo through the passageways and compartments of every ship in the South Pacific Force. The 4 syllables, bereft of any operational specificity or doctrinal nuance and apropos of no particular target, placed a clean vector through everyone's mind that ordered and oriented their next moves. Strike, repeat, strike." If you're looking for a blow-by-blow of the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, this isn't going to be it, of which I'll place a link to a Kings and Generals video that does just that in the description. Anyway, Task Force 16 and 17 headed northwest during the night of October the 25th, and beforehand, PBY Catalinas and B-17s had spotted the Japanese force heading south, and so began the game of hide-and-seek between the Japanese and American forces. The PBYs managed to spot the Japanese early on the 26th again, turning more closely to USS Smith. The Smith was part of Destroyer Squadron 5 and was assigned to help protect USS Enterprise, an unenviable task considering the amount of Japanese aircraft expected to attack the carrier. On the morning of the 26th, at 5 a.m., general quarters were sounded because as the morning went on, it was more and more likely the Japanese would send air attacks as light conditions got better. She followed Enterprise in her various courses and speeds to launch aircraft, either to find and attack the Japanese fleet or to fly combat air patrol over the task force. Where at 6:05, aircraft started taking off to find the Japanese fleet, and at 6:20, the first combat air patrol started to go up. With this combat air patrol up, and those aircraft sent to find the Japanese fleet, which found a part of it, the striking force under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, with the Smith and her crew awaiting the results of those search planes. At 8:10 a.m., their waiting came to an end, as Task Force 16 changed course and speed up to 27 knots, and 25 minutes later, general quarters sounded again, as American pilots had spotted incoming Japanese aircraft. The destroyer rang up to speed and maneuvered to protect Enterprise. The crew waited for more than an hour at their stations, as the Japanese attack did not manifest against Enterprise. Instead, due to a rain squall, the Japanese struck the other carrier, Hornet. But at 9:44, the first information about an attack on Enterprise came through, and at 9:55, she began following different courses and speeds to match the evasive maneuvers the Big E was following. Where at 10:06, the first air attacks came. An hour later, the first registered hits to the Enterprise group came from what was thought to be another threat to the group, Japanese submarines. USS Porter had spotted torpedo tracks too late, and was struck and crippled by a torpedo. In this, the torpedo did not come from a Japanese submarine, but a downed American TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. The TBF had not been able to time its jettison of the torpedo well, and its torpedo hit the Porter. The aircrew were saved by the remaining crew of the Porter, and they were taken onto the USS Shaw, which sank the crippled Porter. At 11:15 a.m., more planes were spotted above the formation, these being Japanese Val dive bombers, which commenced an attack on the Enterprise, where Smith and the other escorts, including the South Dakota, began to open fire on the planes. During this attack, the Japanese managed to score 2 hits on Enterprise. While the attack was going on, the Smith received the reports of the Phantom submarine, and as the Japanese planes were either shot down or headed back to their carriers, the Smith attempted to attack the submarine with her 5-inch guns and 20mm guns. Since there was no submarine, the Smith didn't hit anything besides the sea. This duel with Poseidon only lasted a short period, as at 11:35, the carrier's radar detected more Japanese planes, torpedo bombers, and fighters. 9 minutes later, the cap warned of an attack from the northwest. This meant the Enterprise group had attacks coming from the port and starboard side. Unlike during the dive bomber attack, the cap was more effective, with one Wildcat pilot, Lieutenant Stanley Vatesa, who would down 5 torpedo planes. While pursuing one of these torpedo bombers piloted by Seaman First Class Imi Take, the South Dakota's anti-aircraft guns managed to hit the plane, and it burst into flames and began a rapid dive. With no chance of striking the carrier, Takei looked for the nearest ship to strike, and locked his sights on USS Smith. According to the Smith's deck log, at 11:48, the flaming torpedo bomber piloted by Takei crashed into the ship on the forecastle between the number 1 and number 2 5-inch guns. On impact, the gasoline of the bomber exploded into flames and flowed over the deck and down through the cracks and holes in the destroyer caused by the impact. Large clouds of smoke from the burning gasoline covered the forward part of the Smith. On the other parts of the ship, the crew watched as the plane crashed, witnessing some of the burned crew who were on the forward part of the ship, while others panicked and abandoned ship, never to be picked up. The bridge and gun director had to be abandoned immediately, where Lieutenant Commander Wood, the captain of the ship, was racing to the secondary conning station in the aft deckhouse. Steering control was taken over temporarily by the chief quartermaster in the steering engine room. As the phone connection between the aft deckhouse and the steering room worked, Wood could still relay his command from topside. The situation, already bad for Smith, was about to get a lot worse, as Takei had not released his torpedo when he crashed. While most of the burning fuselage fell overboard and sank, the torpedo remained in the conflagration on the forecastle. At 11:53, the torpedo's warhead detonated because of the heat of the fire. The blast showered the ship with sparks, which ignited signal flags on the bridge and caused several smaller explosions of ready service ammunition at the forward positions. During the time of the warhead explosion, the remaining Japanese planes flew out of range of Task Force 16's guns, and none had hit Enterprise, with 8 being shot down. During this action, Smith had maintained speed, position, and her fire as her aft guns were able to keep up, thanks to the efforts of her crew. Wood, remaining at the secondary conning station, carefully he changed the Smith's position within the task force as he had a plan. He maneuvered his destroyer into the wake of the South Dakota, as the fire on board the ship was likely going to burn out of control. By placing his ship in the wake of the fast battleship, Wood took advantage of the wake of the churning water produced by the large ship's propellers. As the pitch of the Smith increased, water rushed onto the forecastle and helped to extinguish the fire. All the while, the crew struggled to attend to the wounded and fight for the life of their ship. The wounded were moved aft near noon, as smoke filled the forward compartments. And at about the same time, the forward magazines were flooded, and the 4 torpedoes in the forward tubes were jettisoned. Firefighting teams slowly but surely got the fires under control, and soon began regaining control over the forward sections of the ship, including some of the machinery spaces and the forward magazines, where they began throwing overboard hot ammunition. More Japanese attacks came, and the Smith continued to assist in the fight. At 1:25, the fire was finally extinguished, after raging for an hour and 37 minutes. Steering was soon shifted back to the bridge at 1:45, managing to stay within the formation while Task Force 16 withdrew from the area as things did not go perfectly for the American forces in the battle. The forward section of the ship was heavily damaged, and the steering had remained intact through lucky circumstances. The fire and explosion had caused a lot of damage to the equipment and machinery in the forward portion. Both 5-inch guns were wrecked, and the fire control systems as well, not to mention the gutting of several areas in the forward portion of lighting and power. There was also damage from strafing, mostly to the machinery, including boilers. The casualties were heavy, totaling 69, 51 of which were fatalities. 22 were confirmed, and the remaining 29 were missing in action. The crew of the Smith from Wood on down were awarded for their actions, being awarded 9 Navy Crosses, 13 Silver Stars, and 2 Bronze Stars. As I mentioned in the introduction, the Smith went on to make it back to Pearl Harbor for repairs, returning to service in 1943, and was eventually stricken in 1947. The experience of the Smith at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands does foreshadow the destructive power the Japanese kamikazes would inflict on the United States Navy during the later part of the war. Although, it should be said there are examples of similar actions by Japanese pilots earlier in the war, but it also proved that, with some help from Lady Luck, a sound warship, and a well-trained crew, the ships could survive attacks by Japanese kamikaze pilots and continue to fulfill their missions. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands did not go particularly well for the United States Navy. As Hornfisher writes, after the Battle of Santa Cruz, the United States would have not a single operable carrier task force in the South Pacific until the Enterprise could be repaired at Noumea and placed back into service. Task Force 17 was dissolved with the sinking of the Hornet, and with the Enterprise going to the yard for repairs, the South Dakota was sent to join the Washington and Task Force 64. The Japanese did not lose any carrier in the battle, although 2 were damaged, and a large portion of their pilots were shot down. Measured in tonnage, the battle was a significant loss for the Americans, but the Japanese army on Guadalcanal did not take Henderson Airfield. Coupled with the loss of the Japanese pilots and the lack of support from the Japanese Navy on Guadalcanal proper, and the Japanese Navy not reaching Guadalcanal proper, the overall battle could be seen as a strategic American victory, with the historian Samuel Eliot Morson describing how it gave the Americans priceless time to reinforce and prepare. Where again Hornfisher writes, having exhausted their carrier forces in the seas east of Guadalcanal on the 26th, the opposing fleets returned to their bases to regroup. With Halsey's and Yamamoto's carriers sidelined for now, the question to be answered in the parry and thrust of the coming weeks was, which side's surface combat fleet would step up and control the seas by night? No matter how gallantly men fight on land, they would not hold long if their navy finally failed them. In a few short weeks, the greatest challenge yet to the American position on Guadalcanal would loom in the dark waters of Savo Sound. Leading to the cruiser night action of the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal on November 13th, something I discuss in my video on IJN Hiei. Although Smith didn't play an incredibly important role during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, The efforts of her crew were what drew me to her story, and of course, the use of the wake of the South Dakota to help put out the fire. Anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.